Welcome to the mysterious case book where quiet villages hide their darkest secrets. Tonight, as the clock strikes 12 in St. Mary Mead, silence conceals more than sleep. It hides guilt. Where are you tuning in from, detective? Pour yourself something warm. Let the mystery begin. The church clock struck 12, its tone deep and deliberate, carrying across St. Mary Mead like the pronouncement of a judge. Beneath its final echo, the village green lay washed in moonlight, silvering the war memorial, the tea tent, and the bunting that now hung limp after the annual charity fete. What had been laughter an hour ago was now silence, save for the faint rustle of paper cups and the distant creak of a gate swinging idly in the breeze. Mrs. Bantry, still flushed from the excitement of her raffle winnings, was making her way across the green, clutching a rather tasteless porcelain shepherdess. She paused near the trestle tables, squinting at something glimmering by the lemonade stand. A dropped trinket, perhaps. She stooped, then straightened suddenly, her breath catching. It was not a trinket. A hand, pale as milk and quite still, protruded from beneath the bunting. By the time the vicar arrived, his cassock flapping like a startled crow's wing, the small crowd had gathered, each person standing just close enough to appear concerned and just far enough to disclaim any connection. A young constable, new to the district, knelt awkwardly and confirmed what was already apparent. "Dead, sir," he muttered. The vicar crossed himself with a trembling hand. The deceased was a stranger, or nearly so. Some recognized her vaguely as the lady who'd moved into the lodgings by the post office 3 weeks prior. Quiet, well-dressed, and polite. No one knew her name with certainty. Some said Miss Grey, others thought it was Grey with an R. Yet everyone agreed she had the air of someone not quite local. Miss Marple stood just beyond the ring of onlookers, a shawl drawn around her shoulders. Her expression was mild, even sympathetic, but her eyes rested briefly on the porcelain shepherdess Mrs. Bantry still clutched. Her gaze then moved to the half-drunk cup of lemonade near the trestle table, to a ribbon caught on the rough wood, fluttering faintly. To anyone else, these details were detritus of the fate to Miss Marple. They whispered an order, a sequence. But she said nothing. She never did. Not at first. The police arrived in greater numbers soon after, led by Inspector Craddock, who carried an air of weary competence mixed with irritation at being roused from his supper. Statements were taken. Mrs. Bantry's voice shook at all the wrong moments. Mrs. Price Ridley declared, with undue firmness, that such things never happened in respectable villages, a claim which ensured her remark would be repeated at every breakfast table come morning. As the body was taken away on a stretcher, the crowd began to disperse, relieved, solemn, eager to talk. Darkness pooled where the lamps did not reach. A moth circled the gaslight near the tea tent, desperate for warmth and courting death. Miss Marple watched it for a moment, her hand tightening on her cane. "Human nature," she murmured softly to herself, "isn't so very different." Across the green, the clock began again its slow, deliberate chime. 1, 2, 3, its rhythm, patient and unhurried, as if time itself were counting the village's secrets. By the next morning, gossip had replaced shock. The cause of death, poison, someone whispered, had not been confirmed, but the word lingered. Poison was both dreadful and oddly respectable. It suggested calculation, manners, even in malice. The name of Mrs. Bantry's porcelain shepherdess also became an object of fascination, for someone claimed it had been exchanged earlier that evening as part of a raffle prize with the deceased. At breakfast in the vicarage, Mrs. Price Ridley recounted events with the authority of one who had personally conducted the investigation. The vicar, polite but distracted, only nodded while buttering his toast. "Tragic," he murmured. "A visitor to our parish, taken so suddenly." "Not taken," Mrs. Price Ridley corrected. "Delighted to be disagreeable." "Removed. There's a difference." Across the lane, Miss Marple sat before her teacup, steam curling faintly in the morning light. The paper lay folded beside her, its headline restrained, its tone indignant. Mystery at village fete woman found dead. Such restraint, Miss Marple reflected, always meant the reporter was hoping for scandal. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, one needle caught mid-stitch. She could still see the faint tremor in Mrs. Bantry's hands, the way she'd looked not at the body, but at something else entirely, something, perhaps, she didn't wish to recall. A knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Bantry herself, pale, overwrought, and carrying a sense of apology that preceded her speech. "Jane," she said breathlessly, "you won't think me foolish, but they're saying the woman had my raffle ticket, the one I gave away, just for luck." Miss Marple gestured inside. "Come along, my dear. Tell me everything." Her tone was calm, almost motherly, but her eyes had the stillness of deep water. As Mrs. Bantry began to recount the evening's details, how she'd swapped tickets, how she'd thought it a harmless gesture, Miss Marple's fingers resumed their knitting. Each motion of the needles matched the rhythm of Mrs. Bantry's words, are neat, methodical, and inexorable. When the tale concluded, she looked up. "It's curious," Miss Marple said gently. "Luck, you say? So many crimes begin with a gesture meant kindly." She folded her hands over her knitting, her expression unreadable. "And yet, I wonder whose luck, precisely." Outside, the clock began to strike again, each note clear as glass in the autumn air. 12 strokes once more, though the hour was wrong, and the time uncertain. The sound of the misstruck hour still lingered faintly as Mrs. Bantry sat in Miss Marple's neat sitting room, her gloved hands twisting a lace-edged handkerchief into ever tighter knots. The autumn sun filtered gently through lace curtains, catching the motes of dust that danced like pale ghosts in the air. In the garden beyond, a robin hopped across the gravel path, bold as gossip. The world, thought Miss Marple, has the oddest habit of appearing most peaceful just after wickedness has occurred. "I didn't mean anything by it, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, her voice high with a nervous tremor. She'd bought so many tickets already, it seemed only fair to give her one of mine. It was all so silly and friendly at the time. "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple murmured, pouring another cup of tea. "Good intentions are often the wrapping paper of unfortunate deeds." She passed the cup across the table, eyes calm, mind quietly alert. From the lane outside came the faint crunch of bicycle tires and the clipped tones of Mrs. Price Ridley's voice. Yes, the raffle tickets. That's where the whole business began. Always knew it would end in trouble. A pause, then the sharper reply of Miss Weatherby. "My dear, you make it sound as though raffles were the devil's invention." Their laughter drifted away, brittle and self-satisfied. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "The village mind," she said softly, "is a fascinating ecosystem. One must only disturb the surface a little to see what swims beneath." Mrs. Bantry sighed, glancing around the cozy room china shepherdesses on the mantel, a brass clock ticking gently, all reassuringly normal. "You don't think I'm in any sort of difficulty, do you, Jane?" Miss Marple gave a small, non-committal smile. "My dear Dolly, no one in St. Mary Mead is ever in difficulty until, of course, they are." By mid-afternoon, the whole village seemed to revolve around a single axis. The dead woman, Miss Gray or Gray. In the grocer's, her name was whispered over the butter scales in the post office. It fluttered between letters like an unseen draft. Theories sprouted faster than chrysanthemums. Some said she had been jilted, others hinted at blackmail. Mrs. Price Ridley favored foreign connections, which lent the tragedy both mystery and moral superiority. At the Blue Boar, the talk was more robust. "Poison, that's what it was," declared Mr. Larch, the butcher, slapping a hand on the counter. "Quiet sort of crime suits quiet villages." Mark my words, it'll come back to something she ate. The remark earned nods and the solemn clink of beer mugs. But at the vicarage, the conversation was more hesitant. Reverend Clement sat beside his wife, Anne, both subdued by a sense of indecent curiosity. A terrible business, he said, and poor Miss Grey alone, apparently, has no relatives at all. Mrs. Clement stirred her tea, eyes thoughtful. Perhaps not as alone as we think. There were letters, weren't there? Miss Graham at the post office mentioned a foreign stamp Italy, I believe. Indeed. Clement frowned, adjusting his spectacles. Odd. I thought she was English through and through. Miss Marple, who had been invited to tea on some charitable pretext, sipped quietly. People often appear to belong more than they do, she said gently. It's a comforting illusion. Anne Clement leaned forward. You knew her slightly, didn't you, Miss Marple? Oh, only by sight. She had a way of looking at people when she thought no one observed her. The sort of look that suggests she's listening not to what's said, but to what's withheld. The conversation faltered. Reverend Clement coughed, uneasy at the moral implications of that observation. Miss Marple folded her napkin neatly, her eyes resting for a moment on the small silver clock upon the mantelpiece. It had stopped at 12 precisely. Curious, she murmured, how time insists upon certain hours. Even the clocks seemed determined to remember. Outside, the day dimmed into a bruised evening. The lanes smelled of damp earth and smoke. Inspector Craddock, trudging toward the lodgings where Miss Grey had lived, found his own patience wearing thin. The landlady, Mrs. Edgeworth, was a woman of abundant opinions, but little precision. Nice enough, quiet as a mouse. Always paid her rent on time, but I'll tell you, Inspector, there was something sad in her eyes, like she'd known better days. Did she have visitors? Oh, no, not one, except once last Thursday. A gentleman, I think, though he came after dark. I didn't like to pry. She hesitated, then added in a lower tone, but she seemed flustered after he left, tore up some letters. I found the bits in the fire grate next morning. Craddock made a note, his pencil blunt from overuse. C'est bien, did you keep any? Lord, no. I'm not the sort to meddle with other people's ashes. He thanked her and turned to leave, his boots echoing in the narrow corridor. The room Miss Grey had occupied was spare, but tidy: a trunk, a few dresses, a small mirror with a crack through its corner. On the dressing table lay a silver compact case, its powder still faintly fragrant. Inside, pressed into the lining, was a single blonde hair, not Miss Grey's, whose hair had been dark. Craddock frowned, closing the case carefully. By the time he stepped out into the street, the first lamps had been lit. Across the way, he saw Miss Marple emerging from the vicarage gate, her shawl wrapped tight against the wind. She nodded pleasantly as they met. A sad business, Inspector. So much talk already, and so little understanding. He gave a weary smile. That's a village for you, Miss Marple. Everyone knows everything except the truth. Ah, she said softly. But truth is like a flower, Inspector. It blooms only when the season allows, and some gardeners are more patient than others. Craddock tipped his hat and walked on. Miss Marple lingered, her gaze drifting toward the church tower silhouetted against the violet sky. The clock face glimmered faintly, and for an instant she thought she saw movement, someone standing just below it, a shadow that shifted, then vanished. She turned toward home, her steps unhurried, her mind quietly assembling patterns. The robin that had hopped through her garden that morning now perched on the churchyard gate, watching her with small black eyes. Somewhere deep within the tower, the mechanism of the clock gave a faint, discordant tick as though time itself had stumbled. Miss Marple paused, the faintest trace of concern furrowing her brow. Strange, she murmured, how even time can misplace its rhythm. The wind rose, carrying with it a scrap of paper from the churchyard path, a torn bit of raffle ticket, fluttering like a small confession into the dark. The scrap of paper caught on a thorn bush just beyond the churchyard wall. When Miss Marple reached it, the fluttering ceased, and the torn edge revealed half a printed number and a faint trace of lemonade stains. She folded it delicately into her glove, as one might handle a letter meant for someone else. The night air smelled faintly of wet stone and lilac, a sweetness that did not belong to October. Behind her, the church clock gave a tired, mechanical sigh, struggling against its own imperfect rhythm. Inside her cottage, the lamps threw soft pools of light over the chintz and books. Miss Marple placed the scrap of ticket upon a small writing tray beside her teacup. For a while, she merely looked at it, her face unreadable. It was, after all, only a fragment, but fragments, in her experience, were like human stories seemingly meaningless until one learned where they had been torn from. The following morning brought drizzle and gossip in equal measure. The lane outside Miss Marple's gate was alive with speculation, and none louder than that of Mrs. Price Ridley, who had taken up position at the greengrocer's with the dedication of a watchman. "Mark me, it'll come out she wasn't who she said she was," she declared. "You can tell by her shoes, foreign leather, far too fine for lodgings by the post office." "Perhaps a gift," suggested Miss Hartnell mildly, who always preferred charity to malice. "A gift from whom?" Mrs. Price Ridley pounced, triumphant. "Exactly. That's what I've been saying. There's someone behind this, there always is." By noon, even the milkman was suspected of espionage. The village seemed unable to resist transforming mystery into melodrama, as though the real crime lay not in the death itself, but in the sheer inconvenience it posed to their sense of propriety. Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, sat in the vicar's study with his jacket off, rubbing his temples. "We're no further along," he admitted. The post office confirmed several letters from abroad, mostly from Italy, all destroyed. The landlady remembers a visitor but can't describe him properly. No fingerprints on the note, and no families come forward. The vicar poured him a cup of tea strong, without sugar. "In my experience," he said cautiously, "the sins that find their way here are rarely foreign ones." Craddock smiled ruefully. "So I've learned, sir." A knock came at the door, and when the vicar opened it, Miss Marple stood there, neat as a pin beneath her grey shawl, a small parcel in hand. "I thought perhaps you might like some lemon cake," she said pleasantly, her eyes on the inspector. "And since you're here, Inspector, perhaps I might ask, did Miss Grey wear gloves that evening?" I seem to recall she did not. Craddock blinked. "Gloves? I hadn't noticed." "No," Miss Marple murmured, setting down the parcel, "nor did anyone else. Yet she was particular about her appearance. It's often in the absences we find the real story." Her remark hung in the air like faint perfume. Then, with a gentle smile, she added, "You see, one cannot handle certain things without gloves, or perhaps one wished to appear as though one had not." The inspector, half amused and half perplexed, made a note despite himself. "You seem to have a remarkable memory for small things, Miss Marple." "Oh, not remarkable at all," she said, seating herself modestly. "One simply remembers people as one remembers recipes. A pinch too much vanity here, a dash of fear there, it always alters the flavor." Craddock looked at her keenly. "And what flavor do you detect in this case?" "Unfinished business," she replied softly, and perhaps with a little remorse. The vicar cleared his throat, sensing the conversation's moral depth. "It does seem extraordinary, doesn't it, that a stranger should choose to die if she must in the midst of our little fete?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I dare say she did not choose it at all, Reverend. But villagers have a way of drawing such things to themselves. There's something about respectability that invites temptation. It makes sin seem more theatrical." The drizzle thickened outside, turning the garden beyond the study window into a blurred watercolor. Craddock rose. If you'll excuse me, I'll have another look at her room. Sometimes the second visit tells you what the first did not." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, following him with her eyes, "especially if one listens rather than looks." At the lodgings, the inspector stood again before Miss Grey's dressing table. The silver compact lay where he had left it, the faint scent of violet powder still clinging to the air. A drawer, once overlooked, now stuck slightly inside, was a folded piece of paper, part of a letter, scorched at the edges as though pulled too late from a fire. The words were few but arresting. "I cannot forgive what was done at 12. You will answer for it." Craddock frowned deeply. 12. The hour of death? Or something older? He pocketed the fragment, his pulse quickening with a rare sense of direction. Downstairs, Mrs. Edgeworth peered through the crack of the door, hands slick with flour from kneading dough. "Inspector," she called nervously, "there's someone asking after you. A lady." Miss Marple stood framed in the doorway, rain beading her shawl. "I took the liberty," she said gently, "of bringing a few old parish records. They sometimes prove enlightening when names are scarce. One learns who truly belongs and who merely pretends." He accepted them with a grateful nod, though his tone held suspicion. "You don't believe she was just passing through, then?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied, "that no one comes to St. Mary Mead without a reason. We all seek something comfort, concealment, or consequence. The trick, you see, is to know which." Her eyes drifted toward the mantel, where a small photograph hung askew. Mrs. Edgeworth's late husband, in uniform. It had fallen slightly, as if disturbed. Miss Marple straightened it with delicate precision, her fingertips leaving no trace. "Even the dead," she murmured, "disliked disorder." As she left, the inspector unfolded the parish record she had given him. There, among the names of recent lodgers and visitors, one stood out faintly penciled beside Miss Grey's entry, "Mrs. Langford, see also, 1931. He glanced up sharply, but Miss Marple had already disappeared into the rain. Back in her cottage, she laid the parish index on her table, aligning it beside the torn raffle ticket. Two small relics of a story that had yet to confess itself. Beyond the window, the church clock stirred once more to life. It struck cleanly, evenly, perfectly this time, each note ringing as though it sought to correct its earlier mistake. Miss Marple listened until the final echo faded. "There we are," she said softly. "Everything is in order again, at least on the surface." Then, almost absently, she turned her gaze toward the garden path, where footprints not heard downmarked the damp earth, leading to the back gate and away. The faint impressions on the garden path curved toward the gate where the ivy hung thick and overgrown. They were light, almost careful people who knew how to walk without noise. Miss Marple followed them no farther. She merely regarded the marks for a long moment before drawing the curtain gently shut. Some things, she thought, declared themselves only when one stopped looking directly at them. She turned back to her table, where the torn raffle ticket and parish record lay side by side. Her fingers traced the penciled note, "Mrs. Langford, see also." 1931, a modest annotation, but oddly deliberate, as though written by someone reluctant to forget. There were few Langfords in living memory. The name had drifted through the village once, like the echo of a scandal politely buried. Miss Marple's mind went to work with quiet precision, threading recollections through decades of testable confidences. A knock sounded at the door. She opened it to find Inspector Craddock, his hat damp, his manner brisk but weary. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "You mentioned parish records, and I thought, well, perhaps we might compare notes." "Of course, Inspector." She ushered him in. "It's good to see the police treating old gossip as evidence. One so often finds the two are indistinguishable." He smiled faintly, accepting the chair she offered. "I don't deny that human nature's at the bottom of most cases, Miss Marple, but it's the top I have to deal with the facts, not the undercurrents. And yet, she said gently. Undercurrents have a way of changing where one drifts. Craddock produced the scorched scrap of letter he had found in Miss Grey's room and placed it on the table. We found this. It mentions what was done at 12. And now this Langford name appears in your record. Any connection? Miss Marple examined the paper with mild curiosity. Possibly, she said after a pause. The Langfords were once part of the old rectory before it burned. There was a son, if memory serves, sent away under unfortunate circumstances. Some money has gone missing, I think. The hour 12 was mentioned even then. The clock struck as they discovered it. The inspector raised an eyebrow. And you think the family's history ties to our victim? I think, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, that villagers never lose their stories. They merely change the cast. As Craddock departed, the sound of his motor faded up the lane, replaced by the faint chatter of two women passing the garden gate. Their voices carried easily in the still air. It's all in the paper now, said one. Her name, Miss Grey indeed. It was Langford. Fancy that. And they say she came back under an assumed name. Shameful, replied the other, though her tone held satisfaction. Shows what happens when people try to outrun their past. Inside, Miss Marple sat very still. It was not the discovery that interested her, it was the speed of it. Information in St. Mary Mead spread like ivy, but never without someone guiding its tendrils. That afternoon, the vicarage hosted an informal gathering under the pretext of arranging flowers for Sunday service. Mrs. Bantry arrived, pale but defiant, determined to appear useful. Mrs. Price Ridley presided with her usual air of self-importance, and the vicar's wife tried valiantly to keep the peace. In the corner, Miss Marple's quiet presence lent an air of calm inevitability to the room. It's rather dreadful, isn't it? Mrs. Bantry said, twisting a stalk of lilies, that poor woman dying so near our fate. It makes one feel responsible. Rubbish, snapped Mrs. Price Ridley. If people will come into decent villages with questionable histories, they must expect consequences. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap. It's curious, she observed, how easily the innocent are condemned by the well-behaved. Surely you don't think she was innocent? Mrs. Price Ridley's pearls trembled indignantly. I think, Miss Marple replied, that guilt has many disguises. Some are quite charming. A silence followed, uncomfortable, scented faintly with lilies and moral unease. Outside, the clock tower loomed through the vicarage window, its face pale against the greying sky. It had stopped again, the hands frozen precisely at 12. Mrs. Clement noticed first. How strange, she murmured. The verger wound it only yesterday. That evening, Inspector Craddock returned to headquarters with new determination. The connection between Miss Grey and the Langfords, though tentative, had shifted the investigation from vagueness to narrative. A past scandal, a hidden identity, a promise of retribution, it all fit the pattern that crime so often imitated from literature. By morning, the village was buzzing with certainty. It's revenge, they said, or suicide from remorse. Each household chose its own version of the story, tailored to moral preference. Miss Marple, walking to the post office with her knitting bag, heard a dozen accounts before she'd crossed the green. None of them, she thought, were precisely wrong, but neither were they true. Inside the post office, Miss Graham sorted envelopes with crisp efficiency. Morning, Miss Marple. Nasty business, that. The inspector's been asking about her letters again. Italy, France, and once, oddly enough, from London under other name, Mrs. Langford. Indeed, said Miss Marple mildly, accepting her change. Strange how names travel farther than people. As she turned to leave, a small sound stopped her, the faint tinkle of metal striking wood. A key had fallen from the counter, its tag marked 12A storage loft. Miss Marple bent to pick it up. Yours, my dear?" Miss Graham frowned. "That? Oh no, it came in with her parcel last week. She said she'd misplaced the duplicate." Funny, I'd forgotten. Miss Marple placed the key gently back on the counter. We often forget what we most wish to remember. Outside, the fog was lifting, but the damp air still clung to the hedgerows. The old bell in the church tower gave a dry rattle, as though trying to shake free of its silence. Miss Marple paused beneath it, gazing up. Somewhere above, the pigeons stirred restlessly. And near the base of the tower, half hidden by ivy, she noticed something glinting in the earth. A small button, mother of pearl, its surface smeared faintly with violet powder. She held it for a moment in the palm of her glove, watching how it caught the dull light. Then she tucked it away, her expression thoughtful. Later that afternoon, Inspector Craddock stopped by to share his latest conclusion. "We've confirmation, Miss Marple. The victim was indeed Miss Lydia Langford, disappeared abroad years ago. Her father died in disgrace and the son fled. I'd wager she came back seeking to settle some old accounts. There's one living relative left, Edward Langford. He's been traced to London." "How very neat," Miss Marple murmured. "And yet neatness, I've found, is rarely nature's way." Craddock frowned. "You think it doesn't fit?" "Oh, it fits," she said quietly. Perhaps a little too comfortably. As dusk settled, Miss Marple lit a single lamp. Its glow cast soft shadows that trembled on the walls like memories refusing to stay still. She looked toward the window, where the outline of the church tower loomed against the fading sky. The clock face was dark against hands she knew, still fixed stubbornly at 12. She sat down, took out her knitting, and let the needles move without thought. Somewhere in the rhythm of wool and silence, she felt a question forming not of who had killed Miss Langford, but who had wanted the village to believe they already knew. The knitting needles clicked softly in Miss Marple's hands, their quiet rhythm echoing the steady pulse of her thoughts. The lamplight made a halo of pale gold about her chair, glinting faintly off the silver thimble she wore like armor. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the window panes, carrying the faint murmur of the village beyond, a world busily convincing itself the mystery was nearly solved. Yet Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that certainty was the most deceptive of comforts, knitted on in silence. The mother-of-pearl button lay beside her on the table, its sheen dulled now, the faint trace of violet powder nearly faded. A trifling thing, and yet it possessed a kind of quiet insistence. She turned it between her fingers as one might weigh a coin, its tiny imperfections catching the light. Powder, she thought again deliberately applied, yet displaced. A woman who used it would not leave such a mark by accident, which meant, perhaps, that it was never hers to begin with. A soft knock sounded at the door. When she opened it, Mrs. Bantry stood there, half shrouded in her shawl, looking rather as if she had been caught trespassing in her own conscience. "Jane, I had to come," she said breathlessly. "They're saying it was Lydia Langford. How dreadful it sounds to put a name to her, and that her brother is the culprit. Poor man, he hasn't even arrived yet, and already they're calling him a murderer." Miss Marple ushered her in, offering the comfort of tea as naturally as confession. "The village," she said mildly, "loves to save time by choosing its villain early." Mrs. Bantry perched on the edge of the chair, twisting her gloves. "You don't think it's true, do you? About the brother, I mean." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think truth, like tea, must be steeped before it shows its color." The clock on the mantel ticked on, its sound too regular, too polite. Mrs. Bantry hesitated, then leaned forward conspiratorially. "Jane, there's something else. Yesterday, I remembered at the fete when I gave her my ticket. She asked me what I thought of the clock tower. Such a peculiar question. And then she laughed, not pleasantly, and said, 'Some things never strike the same hour twice.' I thought it was just nonsense. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly, though her tone remained mild. How curious. The dead do have a way of leaving riddles behind them. Perhaps she meant to be overheard. The next day brought the London train, and with it Edward Langford, a man of about 40, pale, composed, and carrying the air of someone accustomed to disapproval. Inspector Craddock met him at the station, his manner courteous but guarded. "You're aware, sir, that your sister's death is under investigation?" "Yes," said Langford quietly, "though I did not know she was still in England." His eyes, grey, intelligent, and weary, met the inspector's without evasion. "You think I had reason to harm her?" "It's my duty to ask, sir." Langford gave a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. "Reason, Inspector, is an untidy thing. My sister and I had none to love one another, yet none to hate. But if you wish to know, about 12 o'clock it mattered to us, once. The night my father was arrested, the clock struck 12. Lydia said she'd never forget it. Was she involved in the theft?" Craddock asked bluntly. "No," he said, "but she carried its shame more faithfully than anyone who was." As they walked from the station, Miss Marple stood by the gate of her cottage, as though by coincidence. "Good afternoon, Mr. Langford," she said with gentle courtesy. "I knew your father slightly, long ago. He had a fondness for the Psalms, if I recall correctly." Langford paused, studying her face with mild curiosity. "You have an excellent memory, Miss Marple," she supplied, smiling. "I remember things the way others remember tunes. They return uninvited." He inclined his head, then followed the inspector up the lane toward the lodgings where his sister had lived. Miss Marple watched them go, her gaze lingering not on the man, but on the faint residue of powder on his cuff violet, unmistakably. That evening, the fog settled low, pressing the lamplight into trembling halos. Miss Marple walked to the church, ostensibly to deliver flowers for the altar, though her true purpose was more patient. The verger, a man named Simmons, was in the tower, winding the clocker task he performed with ritual solemnity. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said, doffing his cap. "You've come about the lilies, I expect." "Indeed," she replied mildly, placing the flowers on the pew rail, "though I confess I'm curious about your clock. It seems temperamental lately." He chuckled ruefully. "Temperamental's right, ma'am. Keeps stopping at 12 no matter how careful I am. Must be a fault in the gear work. Nasty thing that night it happened. I was here, you know, putting things in order for Sunday. Heard the first scream clear as day." "From the green?" "From the tower, I'd say," he said uncertainly. "Echoes, perhaps. This place plays tricks on sound." Miss Marple inclined her head, her eyes following the line of the staircase spiraling upward. "Echoes can be useful things," she murmured. "They tell us what the walls have overheard." Before leaving, she laid a small coin on the prayer cushion, an old habit of hers, though tonight it felt almost symbolic, a payment to time itself for its deceit. Later, in her sitting room, she unfolded a page from the local newspaper. A small item near the bottom caught her attention. "Police question London chemist in connection with recent death." The name was illegible where the ink had blurred, but beside it was a faint smudge violet again, where someone's powdered thumb had touched the paper. Miss Marple held it up to the light, then smiled, very slightly. Across the village, Inspector Craddock sat in the vicar's study, looking through his notes. "It's narrowing," he said aloud. "Either Langford brought the poison, or someone wanted us to think he did." The vicar nodded gravely. "One hopes justice will be done." "Oh, justice will come," said Miss Marple's voice from the doorway, her tone as serene as ever. "But whether it comes through law or conscience, that remains to be seen." Craddock glanced up sharply. "You've discovered something." She moved closer, laying the newspaper on his desk. "Not discovered," Inspector only observed. There's a great difference. Sometimes the smallest stain tells us who's been reading too closely." She said no more, but when she stepped back into the chill evening, her face was lit by the faintest gleam of understanding. The church clock, stubborn as ever, gave a single hollow tick and stopped once more precisely at 12. For the first time, Miss Marple thought it might not be the mechanism that was broken, but the hour itself. The faint echo of the clock's single stubborn tick still hung in the air when Miss Marple stepped into the damp night. The village lay subdued under a gauze of mist, lamplight trembling in small, uncertain halos. Far off, a dog barked once, then fell silent, as though reminded that even sound must keep its manners in St. Mary Mead after dark. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her shawl drawn close, her eyes lifted toward the tower whose hands had long refused to move. A broken hour, she thought, is rarely accidental. At the vicarage window, light still glowed, and the faint silhouette of Inspector Craddock passed before it. He had stayed behind after her departure, restless, turning facts into questions and questions into irritations. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Men of logic often struggled most with what refused to align. She found herself, without conscious intent, walking toward the green. The remnants of the fete still lingered, the faint outline of tables marked in flattened grass, a paper garland tangled about a fence post. Even decay, she reflected, has its own order. A shadow moved near the bandstand quickly, then still. "Mr. Langford," she said softly, without surprise. He stepped forward, his expression unreadable in the mist. "You walk late, Miss Marple." "I find thought benefits from darkness," she replied. "It's kinder to half-formed ideas." He gave a dry laugh. "Then you must be thinking about me." "Not entirely," she said, her tone as gentle as rain. "Though I confess you're rather a compelling figure, so calm, so certain. Yet calmness is often a mask worn by the frightened." He stiffened slightly. "You think I'm frightened." "I think," she said, "that your composure fits too neatly. Grief never sits so still, not when one is innocent of its cause." Langford looked away. "You're as shrewd as they say. But you mistake my stillness for indifference. I've simply had more practice than most at watching things fall apart." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Practice can be most enlightening. It teaches us how easily one can rebuild appearances over ruin." For a moment, silence settled between them, heavy but not hostile. Then Langford's voice softened. "My sister wrote to me last month. Said she meant to come back to make something right. I told her not to. There are debts that time won't forgive." "And yet," Miss Marple murmured, "she came." He nodded once, his jaw tightening. She always did what she pleased. Perhaps that was her truest sin. When she returned home, Miss Marple lit the fire and laid her gloves aside. The mother-of-pearl button glinted faintly on the table. She reached for it, but her hand paused mid-air as a knock came hurried, insistent. It was Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, her face pale, her voice trembling. "Jane, I hate to disturb you, but something's happened. They've arrested him." Edward Langford, Inspector Craddock, had no choice. Miss Marple's expression did not change. She rose, steady and unhurried. "No choice," she repeated softly, as though testing the phrase for truth. "That's a dangerous sort of phrase, my dear. It so often excuses the wrong decisions." At the station, the scene was subdued, almost genteel in its efficiency. Langford sat behind the desk, composed once more, his hands clasped loosely. Craddock stood nearby, fatigue etched into his posture. "We found this," he said to Miss Marple as she entered, holding up the silver compact from the victim's room. "His initials inside in gilt, and the chemist confirms the powder contained traces of cyanide." Langford's eyes met hers briefly. There was no plea, no outrage, only resignation. "There, you see," he said quietly. The past keeps its promises. Miss Marple took the compact delicately. May I? She turned it over, her fingertip brushing the hinge. The metal was too clean. Strange, she murmured, how guilt so often polishes what it touches. Craddock frowned. Meaning? She smiled mildly. Only that a guilty object, like a guilty conscience, rarely gathers dust. Leaving the station, she found herself drawn once more to the church. The fog had thinned moonlight and lay pale upon the stones. Inside, the air was cold and faintly scented with polish and lilies. The verger was there again, his back to her, fiddling with the clock mechanism near the vestry door. Still misbehaving? She asked gently. He turned, startled. Oh, Miss Marple. Aye, still sticking. I've taken it apart twice now. Funny thing is, there's always this residue on the gears, like powder. Violet-colored dust. Can't think where it comes from. Her eyes rested on the faint smudge staining his fingertips. No? She said softly. Neither can I. He followed her gaze, flushing. Well, I must. Get on. These old mechanisms. Temperamental things. Indeed they are, she replied, her tone pleasant but her eyes bright. They do love attention. As he left, she stepped closer to the clock. A small wooden drawer beneath the dial stood slightly ajar. Inside, half buried among the spare cogs and tools, lay a crumpled sheet of paper. She drew it out carefully. It was a page from the fête's raffle ledger, the list of winners, scrawled in the vicar's hand. Beside number 12, in a different ink, someone had written a single word, ode. Miss Marple folded the page into her pocket, her expression thoughtful. Outside, the bell gave a soft tremor, almost a sigh, though no wind stirred it. It was as if the mechanism itself wanted to speak. If only someone would listen correctly. She left by the north door, where the yew trees cast long, uncertain shadows. At the edge of the churchyard path, she paused, noticing a light still burning in the vicarage study. Through the open curtain, she saw Mrs. Clement and her husband standing close, their faces drawn with fatigue and moral discomfort. Between them, on the desk, lay the parish ledger, the very volume Miss Marple had borrowed days ago. Mrs. Clement's hand rested upon it protectively, as though shielding something fragile. The next morning, St. Mary Mead was alive again with speculation. Some said Miss Marple had known all along, others that she had misled the inspector deliberately. Mrs. Price Ridley declared at breakfast that it was high time such people were kept out of decent villages. When pressed on whom she meant, she could not quite say. By noon, Miss Marple was seen walking toward the vicarage once more. Inside, she found the vicar pale and uneasy, his wife tearful. Jane, Mrs. Clement began. I can't bear it. I copied the name myself. Lydia's into the ledger when she asked. She said it was only for the records that she was settling a debt to the parish. I thought it was harmless. Miss Marple's face softened. We all wish to believe in harmless things, my dear. That's why evil so often borrows their disguise. The vicar sank into his chair. If she was involved in some blackmail, God forgive me, I thought she was penitent. Perhaps she was, Miss Marple said gently. But confession without truth is merely another kind of lie. She rose, laying her hand lightly on Mrs. Clement's arm. You mustn't blame yourselves. Sin has a habit of hiding behind virtue. It feels safer that way. Outside, the clock struck once more, hesitant, testing its restored rhythm. Miss Marple paused on the threshold, listening, her face grave but calm. There, she said softly to herself, it's learning to keep time again. And yet, even as the sound faded, she could not ignore the faintest irregular echo that followed one tick too many, or perhaps too late. The echo of that uneven tick still hung in Miss Marple's ear as she stepped out into the churchyard. The yews whispered faintly above her, their needles glistening with rain. It was late afternoon now, though the light had the flatness of early dusk, a peculiar stillness that often came before something changed. The clock had spoken again, she thought, not just the mechanism, but the hour itself. And in St. Mary Mead, every hour eventually tells. Down the lane, Inspector Craddock's motor car appeared, its tires whispering over the wet gravel. He drew up beside her, hat pulled low, face set in weary determination. "Miss Marple," he called, stepping out. "I thought I'd find you here." "So few think to look in churchyards," she said mildly, "but they're excellent places for remembering what people wish to forget." He gave a thin smile. "Perhaps that's why you spend so much time on them." "Perhaps," she conceded, and gestured toward the tower. "The clock is keeping a strange time again. It may be trying to tell you something." Craddock's brows lifted. "Mechanisms don't talk, Miss Marple." "Oh, they do," she replied, "if one knows how to listen. But it's human beings who lie most fluently." He exhaled sharply, weary of her riddles. "Langford's been released," he said at last. "Not enough evidence to hold him. He's back at his lodging, and I dare say half the village is disappointed." Disappointed. Her tone was soft, but edged with amusement. He shrugged. "They prefer their villains to be simple, tidy. A dead woman with a scandalous past and a guilty brother makes a fine story." But his voice trailed off. "This keeps slipping sideways." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "That's because it was designed to." He looked at her quickly, but she had already turned her gaze toward the horizon where the mist was thickening again. The church bell gave a faint, uncertain creak, as if preparing to sound, and then, abruptly, it did. 12 times. Deep, deliberate, wrong. The inspector and Miss Marple both froze. It was 4 in the afternoon. "That," Craddock said, his voice low, "shouldn't be possible." "It seems," Miss Marple murmured, "that the dead are punctual after all." Within the hour, the village was in uproar. The bell had drawn them as surely as a signal flare. Mrs. Price Ridley arrived first, demanding divine explanations. Mrs. Bantry, pale and tight-lipped, followed close behind. By the time the verger emerged from the tower, breathless and stammering, a small crowd had gathered near the porch. "I swear it, Miss Marple, it rang by itself." Simmons gasped. "I wasn't anywhere near the mechanism. I was polishing the candlesticks when it began. And look there." He pointed toward the tower's narrow door. The wood bore a dark streak something like ash, or powder, smeared in the shape of a handprint. Miss Marple bent slightly, examining it with that quiet, unhurried precision which made people instinctively hold their breath. "Powder again," she murmured. "How persistent it is, like guilt that clings to everything it touches." The crowd shifted uneasily. Craddock motioned Simmons aside. "We'll search the tower," he said briskly, but Miss Marple's soft voice halted him. "Be careful what you disturb, Inspector. Graves and secrets have this in common. They don't like to be opened too soon." He gave a curt nod and disappeared inside with a constable. The minutes dragged on. Above, a pigeon fluttered from the belfry, its cry sharp as a crack. Then Craddock reappeared, face ashen. "We've found something." The group followed him up the narrow steps into the tower's dim interior. The smell of dust and oil hung thick. Beneath the clock's massive gears lay a bundle of linen, folded neatly, too neatly, and beneath it, the unmistakable gleam of silver. The matching compact to the one found in Lydia Langford's room. This one bore new initials, AIC. "Anne Clement," Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Bantry gasped. "The vicar's wife? But Jane, surely not." "Surely not," Miss Marple agreed, though her tone was neither denial nor surprise. She reached down, brushing a trace of violet dust from the metal surface, and yet the same hand touched both. Craddock's mouth tightened. "We'll have to question her." Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward the narrow window, where the pale light fell across the gears. "Yes," she said, "but gently. There are some truths that bruise too easily when handled by force." By evening, the vicarage was cloaked in a silence far heavier than usual. Mrs. Clement sat near the fire, her hands clasped tightly around a handkerchief that had long since lost its shape. The vicar stood beside her, his expression bleak with the terrible dignity of a man who believes forgiveness must come before comprehension. Craddock began quietly. "Mrs. Clement, do you recognize this?" He laid the compact on the table. Her fingers twitched, then went still. "Yes," she said after a long pause. "It was mine. A gift from my sister years ago. I mislaid it." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost grandmotherly. "And recently, perhaps, found it again." Mrs. Clement's eyes lifted to hers, the faintest flicker of alarm passing through them. "I don't understand." "Forgive me," Miss Marple said softly, "but I think you do. It's difficult to lose what one deliberately leaves behind." The vicar looked between them, confusion clouding his features. "Anne?" She rose suddenly, the movement sharp enough to startle them all. "You don't know what she did," she said hoarsely. "That woman, Lydia Langfordshire, came to me. She said she remembered me from years ago, from London, that she knew what my sister had done. She threatened to tell me unless I paid her silence." Craddock's jaw tightened. "So you met her that night?" "Yes," she whispered. "In the tower. She said it must be at 12 because that was the hour her father's life ended. She wanted poetry in her revenge." Her voice trembled, broke. "But when I went back later, she was already dead. I swear I never touched her." The vicar moved toward her, half in disbelief, half in pity. Miss Marple stepped between them quietly. "And yet you hid the compact." Mrs. Clement's lips trembled. "Because it looked compromising. I thought God would understand if I spared the parish another scandal." "God," Miss Marple said gently, "understands very well what people do in the name of decency." For a long moment, only the clock's muffled hum filled the room. Then Craddock spoke. "We'll need your statement, Mrs. Clement, but for what it's worth, I believe you." When they stepped outside, the rain had ceased. The air was sharp, clean and faintly metallic, like a wound beginning to close. Miss Marple walked with the inspector toward the gate. "She may be telling the truth," Craddock said, "but the pieces still don't fit." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "They never do, until someone stops trying to force them." She looked up at the tower, now dark and still. A faint glimmer of light showed briefly in one of its narrow slits, a candle, or perhaps a lantern. Then it vanished. "Tell me," Craddock said quietly, "what do you make of that?" Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. "That someone else is still awake at 12. And as the church bell gave one soft, hesitant clang half-formed, half-swallowed by the fog she felt, for the first time, the chill of the truth drawing near. The echo of that half-swallowed clang trembled through the mist, then died, leaving St. Mary Mead suspended between one heartbeat and the next. Miss Marple stood still, her eyes fixed upon the faint slit of the church tower where the light had glimmered a moment before. The night seemed to hold its breath. When she finally moved, it was with deliberate calm, a quiet descent from speculation to purpose. "Inspector," she said softly, "if you would be so kind as to leave the tower to me for a little while." Craddock gave her a sharp look. "It's hardly safe." "Safety," Miss Marple replied, "is a most overrated virtue in moral inquiries. A criminal, you see, often behaves like a conscience returning to the scene of the offense when everyone else prefers to forget it." He hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, but I'll be close by." Miss Marple inclined her head. "That, Inspector, is precisely what I rely upon." The church stood open when she reached it, as she knew it would. No lock in the village stayed locked long when curiosity was abroad. Inside, the candles upon the altar burned low, their flames stooping and swaying like old women gossiping over secrets. She moved quietly, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the stone floor. The air smelled of brass polish, lilies, and damp wool, the same scent she remembered from the night of the fete. Her fingers brushed the pew rail as she passed, feeling the faint roughness where polish had been hastily applied. Appearances always began with surface care. She reflected deceit with its polish. The narrow stair to the tower spiraled steeply upward. She climbed slowly, stopping once as the sound of footsteps echoed faintly from below. Measured, cautious. She continued upward, each step a conversation between breath and silence. At the top, the mechanism loomed before her, a massive skeleton of brass and shadow. The hands of the clock, visible through the narrow window, glowed dimly in the moonlight, and beside the gearwork, a small lamp burned, its wick turned low. Someone was already there, Miss Marple said in a voice, low and strained. "You shouldn't have come." She recognized it at once, the verger, Simmons. He looked different now. The polite stoop of humility had straightened into something sharper, wary. His hands were smudged with violet dust. "I thought perhaps I might find you keeping vigil," she said mildly. "It's a commendable habit." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You think I'm guilty. I think you are troubled," she said gently. "And people who are troubled often confuse penance with concealment." His eyes darted to the mechanism. "You don't understand. I was only trying to put things right. The bullet was wrong, always wrong. It should have struck cleanly. She wanted it too." "She?" Miss Marple prompted softly. He swallowed hard. "Miss Langford. She came to me that evening. Said she had business with the past. Asked if she might be here at midnight, said she wished to hear the clock strike true. I didn't see harm in it. But later she was gone. And when the police came, I knew how it would look." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "So you touched the mechanism?" "Yes. To clean it. There was powder everywhere. I didn't know what it meant. I just didn't want her name dragged through it again. She'd suffered enough." "And yet," Miss Marple murmured, "her suffering seems to have inspired quite a chorus of sympathy from unlikely corners." Simmons turned toward her sharply. "You think I killed her?" "I think," she said, "that guilt is not confined to the guilty. It's a contagion of conscience." For a long moment he said nothing. Then his shoulders sagged. "You've got the wrong idea. I never touched her. But there was someone else before midnight while I was fetching oil from the vestry. A woman. I heard her voice. She was crying. I thought it was the wind." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "And what did she say?" He closed his eyes, the words coming reluctantly. "She said it was meant for him." Miss Marple's hands tightened on her cane. Below, faint and rhythmic, came the sound of approaching footsteps. Craddock, no doubt, kept his promise. The moment was fragile now, poised like a candle flame in a draught. She stepped closer to the verger. "Simmons, my dear man, you must tell the inspector what you've told me. But wait until morning. By daylight, people tell the truth more willingly. They confuse it less with fear." He nodded uncertainly, and she touched his sleeve in reassurance before descending the stair. Outside, Craddock was waiting by the lich gate, his face shadowed by the rising mist. "Well," he demanded quietly. "She's not the only woman whose conscience tolls at midnight," Miss Marple said. "But the hour is not yet finished." He frowned. "You mean there's another?" "Perhaps," she said, "the true intended victim." They walked in silence toward the vicarage. The lane was slick with dew, and somewhere a gate clicked softly, though neither of them had touched it. When they reached the green, Miss Marple stopped. "Inspector," she said, I wonder if you might allow the clock to strike once more tonight at the proper hour. Make no announcement. Simply ensure that the tower remains unguarded. Some truths prefer to be overheard. You think someone will return? I think, she said, her eyes on the dark silhouette of the tower, that guilt, like time, cannot resist repetition. By 11, the village lay in uneasy sleep. Only the faint glow of the vicarage window and the soft creak of the clock's winding broke the stillness. Craddock, concealed near the churchyard wall, watched the door of the tower. The fog had thickened again, curling around the gravestones like slow smoke. The first stroke of 12 began deep, deliberate, carrying far through the still air. Then, from within the tower, came the flicker of a lantern, followed by a shadow slipping through the open door. Craddock moved forward, but Miss Marple's hand, light and firm, caught his sleeve. Patience, Inspector. The truth is about to keep its appointment. Inside, the bell gave its final, flawless strike. Then silence. A single, sharp cry followed a gasp more of shock than pain. When they entered moments later, the lantern lay overturned, and beside it, a woman crouched on the cold stone floor, her gloved hand outstretched toward the clock's pendulum. The violet stains glimmered faintly under the lamplight. "Mrs. Bantry," Craddock said in disbelief. She looked up, eyes wide, caught between defiance and collapse. "It shouldn't have been her," she whispered. "It was meant for him." Miss Marple said nothing. She only closed the lantern, dimming the light to a soft, trembling glow that left the truth half seen, like remorse itself. Outside, the clock ticked on, steady now, its rhythm at last restored. The rhythm of the clock continued, steady now, as if time itself were relieved to have been exorcised of its fault. The last echo of the bell melted into the fog, leaving behind a silence that trembled like breath held too long. Miss Marple watched Mrs. Bantry's shaking hand fall from the pendulum. The older woman's hat sat askew, her pearls gleaming like tiny moons beneath the wavering lantern light. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his face unreadable. "Mrs. Bantry," he said, his voice formal now, "I'll have to ask you to come with me." She looked up at him with eyes stripped of their usual sparkle. "You can't. You don't understand. It wasn't murder, not really. It was a mistake. I didn't mean her. I only wanted to frighten him." "Who?" Craddock asked sharply. "Edward Langford?" Her lips parted, then closed again. She turned her face away, the gesture both proud and pitiful. "Please, Inspector, not here," she whispered. "Not in front of Jane." Miss Marple said quietly, "My dear, I'm only a listener. It is often the listener who best remembers the truth." For a long moment, Mrs. Bantry sat perfectly still, her breath shallow. Then, slowly, she reached for the fallen lantern and set it upright, the flame flickering back to life between them. The light painted her face in strokes of guilt and dignity. "I didn't poison her, but I did give her something I should never have had." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind moved swiftly beneath its calm surface. "Something you had kept," she murmured, "or something you were meant to pass on." Mrs. Bantry met her eyes with quiet despair. "You always see too much, Jane." When they brought her back to the vicarage, the clock had struck once again, this time correctly, properly measured. It was 12:30. The village slept unaware, while inside time seemed to move with exaggerated delicacy, like a watchmaker handling fragile gears. Mrs. Bantry sat before the fire, while Craddock stood over her, arms crossed. Miss Marple, slightly apart, occupied her usual chair, her knitting idle in her lap. The fire's glow caught on the polished mantel, where a small shepherdess porcelain, absurd, faintly comic, looked down on them all. "You gave Miss Langford something," Craddock said. "What was it?" Mrs. Bantry pressed her handkerchief against her mouth. "The ticket," she said at last, "the one from the raffle. But that wasn't the point. It was what came with it." The shepherdess, Miss Marple murmured. Yes. Her voice was barely audible. There was something inside. My husband Arthur had bought the thing years ago at a jumble sale. I'd always meant to throw it out, but the base was heavy, hollow, and last month when I dusted it, it rattled. Craddock leaned forward. You opened it? Mrs. Bantry nodded. A little compartment at the bottom. Inside was a broker man's crest, gold engraved. I didn't recognize it, but I knew it was old, valuable. Arthur told me it must have belonged to the Langfords once, before their ruin. He meant to take it to the police, but he fell ill again, and her voice cracked. I thought it would make a nice raffle prize. Harmless. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the shepherdess. And Miss Langford received it. Yes. She laughed when I handed it to her. Said it was fitting that the village would finally give something back. I thought she was being clever. I didn't understand. Craddock's voice was tight. And you suspect that brooch is connected to her death? Mrs. Bantry's hands twisted together. It was the family crest, Inspector. It must have meant something to her, or to someone else who knew. The inspector paced the rug, his frustration controlled but evident. We've searched her lodgings twice. No brooch. Then it was taken, Miss Marple said quietly. Stolen not for value, but for silence. She rose and went to the window, parting the curtain, slightly. The fog was thinning, replaced by a pale pre-dawn light that turned the green into a flat mirror of greys. She spoke without turning. When one lives in a village long enough, one learns the order of things. Secrets are like debts, they pass from one generation to another. Each expects to pay a little less, and yet the total remains the same. Craddock regarded her. You're suggesting Miss Langford didn't come back for revenge, but for restitution. Miss Marple inclined her head. Perhaps both. The line between the two is often thinner than conscience cares to admit. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. You make it sound inevitable. Human nature, she said gently, is almost mathematical in its inevitability. The room was still open again. Mrs. Bantry's face had softened into the melancholy of acceptance. Jane, she said, I've done dreadful things, small ones perhaps, but they've added up. I thought decency could cover them like a good tablecloth. But now Miss Marple smiled faintly. It rarely does. There are stains that no amount of starch can hide. Craddock turned toward the door, restless. We'll search the tower again. If the brooch exists, it must have passed through someone's hands tonight. Not tonight, Miss Marple said. Earlier, before the bell rang wrong the first time. He paused, half impatient. Then who? Her eyes went to the mantel clock, its face catching the firelight. The one who needed to hear the bell strike at 12 to prove the past could still answer. Mrs. Bantry's breath caught, but Miss Marple's expression was serene, as though she were discussing the weather. We've been thinking of the hour as symbolic, she continued. But perhaps it was practical. The clock, Inspector, does not simply mark time. It hides it. Craddock frowned. You mean something's inside the mechanism? Or behind it, Miss Marple said softly. A space only the verger or someone who understood its rhythm would notice. Time conceals, Inspector, but it also records. Each hesitation of the bell, each false chime was a message. Mrs. Bantry looked bewildered, but who could read such a thing? Only someone who was listening for it, Miss Marple murmured. Someone who had waited years for the sound of 12. A knock interrupted them. It was the vicar, pale, hatless, his expression troubled. I beg your pardon, he said breathlessly. The verger Simmons is gone. His tools, his coat, everything. Craddock swore softly. Then it was him all along. Miss Marple shook her head. No, Inspector, not all along, only lately. The difference is crucial. Outside, the dawn was breaking thin, reluctant, silver against the roofs of St. Mary Mead. The church bell gave one hesitant clang, though no one touched the rope. Miss Marple turned toward the sound, her face unreadable. "The clock," she said, almost to herself, "has begun to remember." And in the distance, faint but distinct, another bell answered 12 slow, echoing strikes, though the hour was wrong and the air perfectly still. The twin echoes faded into the morning mist, leaving behind a silence so taut it felt almost deliberate. Miss Marple stood by the window, her shawl drawn close, listening as though the air itself might confess. The sound had come not from the church tower, but farther off, thin and hollow, like an imitation of time rather than time itself. Inspector Craddock, still by the door, was already reaching for his hat. "That came from the mill," he said sharply. "The old one beyond the copse." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes, the one long abandoned except by those who wish not to be seen." They took the lane together, the dawn still half-formed, mist clinging low over the hedgerows. The air smelled of wet stone and the faint bitterness of ashes from cottage fires being rekindled. Every few steps, the sound of the distant bell came again, each chime imperfect, faltering as though rung by a hand, unpracticed or desperate. When they reached the mill, the great wheel stood still, a relic of some older industry, its paddles blackened with moss. The door hung slightly ajar. Craddock motioned for silence and pushed it open, revealing a room half-collapsed from neglect. And yet, within the ruin, something recently disturbed the duster set of footprints and the unmistakable gleam of brass. Miss Marple stepped closer. "The old clock face," she murmured. "Someone moved it here." Indeed, leaning against the far wall was a smaller dial, half-painted, half-ruined, its numerals ghostly in the light. Beneath it lay Simmons, the verger alive, but slumped against a beam, one arm pressed to his chest. His breathing was shallow but steady. In his other hand, he clutched the missing brooch, the Langford crest catching a dull gleam of daylight. Craddock knelt beside him, checking the pulse. "He's fainted, nothing worse. But by heaven, he's been running all night. Look at this mess, God knows what he's done." Miss Marple, stooping delicately, examined the brooch. "It seems, Inspector," she said softly, "that Mr. Simmons has been keeping time in more ways than one." He frowned. "You mean he stole it?" "I mean," she said, "that he found it and tried to hide it somewhere time itself might disguise it. The tower, perhaps. But when the mechanism faltered, so did his courage." Simmons stirred faintly, eyes fluttering open. "It wasn't for me," he muttered. "It was hers. She said she'd come back for it and said the clock would tell her when." Miss Marple knelt beside him, her voice low and kind. "Miss Langford told you that?" He nodded weakly. "She made me promise to keep it safe, to make it ring again. She said the hour must be exact this time or the wrong person would pay." "The wrong person?" Craddock pressed. "Who?" But Simmons' head fell back, the answer lost to faintness. They carried him to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement arranged a bed in the study. The vicar moved about helplessly, murmuring prayers under his breath, while Miss Marple sat quietly beside the window. Her eyes never left the brooch on the table. It was a curious thing exquisite in craftsmanship, the engraved crest worn faintly smooth. A lion rampant and a clock face beneath it, hands fixed eternally at 12. Miss Marple regarded it as one might an old photograph, something too deliberate to be coincidence. Craddock stood beside her. "We'll trace this to see if it ever appeared in the theft records, but I can't see how it ties to the poison." "Oh, I think it ties to something far older than poison," Miss Marple said softly. "It's a mark of ownership, Inspector, and ownership, as I've observed, is very rarely about property." He sighed. "You mean pride?" "Pride," she agreed, "or perhaps penance disguised as it." Outside, a shaft of sun slipped through the thinning fog, striking the silver clock on the mantel. For the first time in days, it gleamed without distortion. The moment's clarity seemed to pierce the room. Mrs. Bantry, pale but composed, entered carrying a tray. "I thought tea might help," she said, her voice controlled, almost formal. She set the tray down, her eyes flickering to the brooch. So that's what it was about. Miss Marple looked up. "You knew of it?" "Only that it existed," Mrs. Bantry said. "Arthur mentioned it once some family heirloom the Langfords had pawned before their disgrace. He said it was cursed. I thought he was being dramatic." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Curses are often simply crimes that outlive their culprits. The door opened again, and a constable stepped in. "Inspector, the bell at the tower's been tampered with again. Ropes cut clean through." Craddock swore softly. "That means someone else was there after us." Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet click. Naturally. Evil, like gossip, dislikes silence for long. He looked at her with a mixture of exasperation and admiration. "You really think this is still unfinished?" "I think, Inspector," she said mildly, "that when one chime falters, another always follows. The question is who listens next." By afternoon, the village's polite composure had begun to fray. Mrs. Price Ridley called on everyone she disliked, thinly veiling her visits as moral concern. The grocer's boy reported seeing Edward Langford on the edge of the green, staring up at the church tower, and Mrs. Clement, pale and hollow-eyed, walked to Miss Marple's cottage just as the light was fading. "I can't bear it, Jane," she said, her voice breaking. "There's something I didn't tell the inspector. Lydia Langford came to me before the fete. She said she'd been wronged, but not by her family, by someone who'd betrayed her father. She wanted my help finding an old letter. Two told her where the church kept its parish records. She must have seen something there." Miss Marple listened without interruption, her knitting silent now, her face softened by what might have been pity or sorrow. "You did nothing wrong, my dear," she said, quietly. "But you see, truth has the inconvenient habit of remembering what we prefer to misplace." Mrs. Clement pressed her hands together. "And now she's dead, and that poor man nearly stopped. Do you think Edward Langford is in danger?" Miss Marple rose, laying a gentle hand on her arm. "Danger often begins with those who think themselves safe." At that very moment, the distant bell began again, 3 times, harsh and uneven. Then silence. Craddock burst through the garden gate moments later, his coat half-buttoned, his face grim. "Langford's gone," he said. "His room's empty, and someone left this." He handed Miss Marple a scrap of paper, torn from the edge of a hymn book. On it, in a neat, deliberate hand, were written 3 words, "At 12 again." Miss Marple folded the note, her eyes calm though her pulse quickened. She looked toward the horizon, where the tower's silhouette rose like an accusation against the paling sky. "Ah," she said softly, almost to herself, "so the clock still insists on keeping its appointment." And as the first low gust of evening wind stirred the curtains, she turned toward the vicar. "You'd best have the bell prepared, my dear. I suspect tonight it will strike not for the dead, but for the living." The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint metallic smell of the church bell's bronze and the colder scent of rain that would not yet fall. Miss Marple stood on the vicarage path, her eyes lifted toward the tower's dark silhouette. It loomed calm now, though the village beneath it stirred in unease. She had asked for the bell to be readied once more, at 12 precisely. It would be the last time, she thought, that St. Mary Mead mistook the sound of order for peace. Inside, the vicar moved nervously among the pews, straightening hymn books that did not require straightening. "Jane," he said, glancing up as she entered, "this feels rather like a sermon one daren't deliver." "That's the nature of truth, my dear," she replied kindly. "It always sounds inconvenient when one has grown used to civility." Inspector Craddock stood near the chancel rail, his coat collar turned up. "Everyone's here, Miss Marple. Langford was found near the green not an hour ago, half-starved. Claims he's been hiding from whoever tampered with the bell. Simmons insists on attending too, saying he wants to hear the clock set right. I've seated them apart." "And Mrs. Bantry?" Miss Marple asked. "In the front pew," Craddock said grimly. "She looks ready to break." Miss Marple nodded. "Then let us begin, before time decides to misbehave again." The church door creaked as the small company gathered. The verger, pale but resolute, sat hunched with his cap in his hands. Edward Langford stood near the aisle, his face gaunt, his composure fraying at the edges. Mrs. Bantry's gloved fingers rested tightly on her lap, her pearls faintly trembling with each breath. At the far end, Mrs. Clement sat beside her husband, her face turned upward, toward the altar, as though seeking permission for what was about to unfold. Miss Marple took her place by the font, where the light from a high window fell across her grey shawl. "We are here," she began gently, "because we've all been listening to the wrong clock." A rustle moved through the pews. Her voice was calm, but her words carried with the precision of a bell's tone. "Every chime has a purpose," she continued. "Each strike at 12 these past nights was not a haunting, but a correction. The clock has only been repeating what someone told it to someone who knew that time, like guilt, leaves its impression on metal." Craddock frowned slightly, but did not interrupt. Miss Marple looked toward Simmons. "You, my dear man, kept the clock faithfully, though not quite honestly. You knew Miss Langford's visits were not merely nostalgic. She had discovered something hidden in that same mechanism, a compartment, perhaps, behind the dial." Simmons nodded, sweat glistening on his brow. "A letter," he whispered. "Old paper, brittle. Signed with my father's name and another Arthur Bantry." A sound escaped Mrs. Bantry, half gasp, half sob. Her gloved hand flew to her mouth. Miss Marple's tone softened. "Yes, the missing piece of an old scandal. The Langford ruin was not theft alone, it was betrayal shared. Your husband, my dear, kept the letter, meaning to burn it, but conscience is such a tiresome keeper. He hid it inside that porcelain shepherdess instead. Miss Langford learned the truth, as victims so often do, years too late." The vicar murmured a prayer under his breath. Craddock's pencil halted mid-note. Miss Marple's eyes moved toward Edward Langford. "You came back not to avenge your father, but to stop your sister. You feared exposure would destroy what little dignity your family retained. You tried to persuade her to leave, but she refused." Langford's composure cracked. "She wanted them to know," he said bitterly. "Said she'd ring the bell herself when justice was done." "She did," Miss Marple said gently. "But she never lived to hear its echo. Someone else decided that 12 should strike for silence instead. The pause that followed was long, deliberate. Only the faint ticking of the tower's gears filled it. "Poison," Miss Marple went on softly. "The most respectable of weapons, quiet, convenient, terribly polite. Mrs. Bantry, you told yourself it was to frighten her, not to harm. Yet fear and death often drink from the same cup. You meant the drought for Edward, not for Lydia. But fate, like a clock, observes no preference." Mrs. Bantry's head bowed. Her pearls trembled once more and broke, scattering across the stone floor like tiny echoes. "I thought she'd forced him into it," she whispered. "I wanted to stop her from another scandal, another ruin." "I never meant," Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice a whisper of pity. "My dear, morality and malice have long shared a tea-table in this village. You only forgot which cup was which." Craddock moved forward quietly, his voice measured. "Mrs. Bantry, we'll need you to come with us." She rose slowly, her dignity clinging to her like perfume. "Of course," she said faintly. "It's only proper." As the door closed behind her, the church seemed to exhale. Simmons buried his face in his hands. Langford sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the altar's brass cross. The vicar reached out to his wife, their hands trembling into one another's. Miss Marple looked up at the tower where, unseen, the great gears stood waiting. "There's a curious mercy in time," she said softly. "It strikes for the wicked as well as the weary, and yet it never stops long." We go on, pretending not to hear its meaning. Craddock turned to her, his expression grim but respectful. "You could have told me sooner." "I could have," she agreed. "But truth, like faith, requires patience. Too soon and it breaks under its own weight." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering softly against the church roof. The sound mingled with the faint stir of the bell as it prepared to strike once more. Miss Marple stood beneath it, listening not to the chime itself, but to the silence it would leave behind. When the 12 strokes finally came, clear and flawless, she closed her eyes. "Ah," she murmured, "how punctual forgiveness can sound if one listens with care." The clock stilled. Time resumed, and in the hush that followed, St. Mary Mead felt, for the first time in many days, properly awake.